My name is Mike Albu, and I work with the DCED, the Donor Committee on Enterprise Development, and I look after the BEAM Exchange, which is the platform for knowledge exchange and learning about market systems development. And we have this space called Grab the Mic, which we offer to practitioners to share their experiences from the field or their learning lessons and ideas. And today, it's a particularly special webinar actually, because we're going to be talking about adapting market systems development to fragile and conflict affected situations, and whether there are any lessons from that for COVID response. And this webinar comes out of a piece of work that was commissioned by the Donor Committee on Enterprise Development through our working group on market systems development. So this is actually, as you I'm sure know already, linked to a policy note that the consultant Karri Byrne, who's going to be speaking today, wrote with a lot of input from practitioners and donors. So in a sense, we're presenting our own work, the work of the DCED's working group on market systems development today. So it's a privilege to have you all listening to us. So the working group commission through GIZ, through the working group, commissioned Karri Byrne to write these papers. She is an independent consultant with a lot of experience working on market systems and resilience in both humanitarian and development settings, which is why we really wanted her to do this work. And then she's going to be backed up by brief presentations by, I hope, the four other speakers that you can see on the slide there. So Sasha Muench, who is the country director for Mercy Corps in Palestine, and previously held a range of roles in Mercy Corps related to developing programs using market systems approaches. Then we have Laura Meissner, who is the Senior Economic Recovery and Markets Advisor for USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, working through the University of Arizona. And then we will have Corrie Sissons, who has 9 years experience of working in humanitarian food security, cash and markets programming, and is a technical advisor for Catholic Relief Services. And finally, if we can get her, I'm hoping very much we'll have Aysha Johnson, who, as I just mentioned, is FCDO, the British Embassy in Mogadishu. Right, I think we'll have to start, even though Aysha hasn't joined us yet, and hope that she does join us at the last minute. What we're going to do is we'll have about 30 minutes of presentations from Karri and these four speakers, and then we'll switch into Q&A mode. If you're not familiar with Zoom, you'll see down the bottom somewhere a Q&A icon, which is a little button you can click on, and you can type your questions in there, which I will moderate and sort of allocate to the speakers when we get to the Q&A session. But that's the place to go. If you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A box. There's a chat box as well if you want to chat to other people, but for questions to the speakers, it's the Q&A box. Okay, let me not prevaricate anymore, and I will hand over to our first speaker, which is Sasha Muench from Mercy Corps. Sasha.
Thank you very much, and thank you all of you for joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are. And as Mike just mentioned, before I came to Palestine, I spent the previous 10 years driving Mercy Corps' global approaches to market systems development and market approaches in crisis. And so naively, I believed that Palestine was the perfect place to apply market principles to fragile contexts. It's obviously a very protracted crisis, so it's stable. It has high capacity, and there are market opportunities. And instead, the obstacle I ran into very quickly is what I call the monster we created. And the best example I can give to illustrate that is an incredibly competent woman I met in Gaza who works full-time supporting her family business of a small factory. But she's the third generation in her family to receive regular parcels of flour and oil and other basic needs, because we've been doing in-kind distributions directly in Gaza for more than 50 years. And the humanitarian community has created a dependency machine that by some estimates has led to up to 80% of Gazans being dependent on aid. And this is not because they're not capable. It's that we haven't let them utilize their capabilities. But obviously then the last year and a half have not been normal. And even before COVID in Palestine, aid levels were declining and we couldn't meet the existing need. Then in March 2020, COVID hit hard and early here, and there were widespread lockdowns. And suddenly there were hundreds of thousands of people newly poor or deeper in need. But there was limited resilience in the system. Government and support systems are weak, there are constrained markets, and the existing humanitarian and development programs implemented at an individual level, not a systems level. And that meant they couldn't adapt. The only thing we know how to do is increase the amount of aid to meeting increased need, and there was no more money. And so stepping back, the question now is, can this be the moment? Is this the thing that forces us to change how we work here? And it should be the thing that forces us to change our approaches in Palestine.
Great.
Thank you, Sasha. That's really interesting little sort of snapshot of what this junction of humanitarian and development market programming looks like. If I could, the risk of simplifying what you're saying, and in a sense, what I sensed you were saying was that a kind of lack of familiarity with systemic approaches leads to an implicit preference for direct delivery of aid. But that this COVID pandemic might offer an opportunity to sort of shake these old patterns up. Is that right?
Exactly, yes.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, thank you. Let's go on to the next story, which is from Laura Meissner, who, as I said, is with the US Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. Laura.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. So my story takes place a couple of years ago. I was filling in at what was then the USAID OFTA's regional office in Dakar in Senegal. And there had been a drought in northern Senegal. Now, we didn't usually have humanitarian programming there since it was a fairly stable country, but we did want to respond. So we thought, let's do a crisis modifier. We can add on to an existing development program that was there, that was supporting very poor agro-pastoralists. And in that way, we could help support the drought recovery and make best use of USAID's development investments as well. Now, my job, as Mike had kindly introduced me, I'm an economic recovery and markets advisor in the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. So you would think I would be really good at helping translate between the humanitarian and the development worlds, between kind of humanitarian response and market systems development. You would be wrong. I came into this, we planned the trip. My colleague at the USAID mission on the development side was like, yes, this sounds like a great idea. I'm glad you're going to visit this project. We drive all the way up into Matam. We are going around with the partner. We're visiting villages, visiting the regular development participants in the program. We're visiting the people who are supposed to be the recipients of the humanitarian assistance. And I finally asked, they were supposed to be receiving some small livestock. I said, well, where are they? Can I see some of the animals? And the local NGO rep looked at me and she was like, why would we do that? This is a terrible time for that. Why would we do restocking when they're just coming out of a drought? Which, fair point. Then I finally get back to Dakar. I check in with my mission colleagues on the development side. And I said, I really kind of thought, you know, it's been 10 months since we gave this assistance. We thought they would have done something. And they were like, what's the rush? This is a 5-year program. What's the problem? Genuinely just didn't understand. And that was really an aha moment for me, that when we talk about timing or objectives or what's humanitarian response or who are we trying to help, that we cannot assume that we know what the other side is talking about or how they're using terms.
Amazing. Okay. Yeah. No. Well, it is a bit of an eye-opener, isn't it? I think for everyone. In a sense, so what you're saying really, what it reminds me of is something in the policy notes, which is, the huge importance of encouraging better communication and collaboration across this divide between humanitarian and development. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Good. All right. Let's move on then. Let's carry on with another donor story. Aysha, thank you for joining us. I know it was tricky. Are you able to share your voice, if not your video?
I'll definitely share my voice, and I'll share my video just to say hi to everybody from a chilly Nairobi, and then I'll go back onto voice just to maintain the bandwidth. Hi. Great. So my story, similar to Sasha's story, is around kind of the COVID-19 response. We were just in the process of finalising the new economic development programme for Somalia, which included quite a sizable kind of market systems, value chain development programme in southeast Somalia, which is the area most affected by conflict when COVID-19 hit. As many of you will know, Somalia is at the extreme end of the fragile and conflict-affected state spectrum. It's been in a situation of conflict for decades now, and it has a regular cycle of shocks, including droughts and desert locusts at the current time. It's towards the bottom of most development indices, unsurprisingly, particularly on human development. And it's a long-term recipient of humanitarian aid that are delivered in a range of kind of innovative ways, including digital, but also kind of cash transfers. What many of you won't know is that Somalia is also a super dynamic private sector environment. And the private sector has been delivering a range of goods and services, including some quite sophisticated services in the financial service and telecom sector for decades during the conflict and before. And Somalia does have a long history of kind of trade. So when COVID-19 hit, we didn't really know what the implications of the pandemic would be, or nor sure how we should respond. And that's largely because there is a real kind of deficit in data in Somalia. Most of our data is kind of pulled together from our programmatic work rather than the usual standardized data sources. So first of all, we as development actors, both internally, so the ECDEV people sat with the humanitarian resilience and various others, to put our heads together to kind of think and to assess the extent of some of the challenges that were being posed by COVID-19, and to get a kind of better picture of some of where the main issues were. And we did the same at the international development partner level as well. This kind of resulted in us commissioning some joint pieces of research to find out where some of the main challenges were. And we got together, we got to the bottom of some of the issues around whether food availability and food markets would be functioning, were functioning. And indeed, we found that food availability wasn't an issue. It was more a question of reduced purchasing power and demand, both domestic and external, with some of the trading routes kind of shut down. So as development partners within as the UK and more broadly, we adjusted our response to the findings of the data. The humanitarians focused on cash transfers and partnerships with some of our businesses to, for example, ensure that some of the inputs markets continued to function. And we adjusted our programming, giving our partners the mandate to pivot activities to focus on the availability of finance and to repurpose businesses instead of around kind of growth objectives, around survival in the first instance and then growth subsequent kind of to that. I'm pleased to say that many of the changes that we instituted have stuck in terms of development partner coordination, internal and external, and that many of the businesses and value chains that we've supported are managing to weather the storm and maintain jobs and services within local markets. But of course, that's in the context of a time-bound crisis, and we find that the pandemic is continuing on. And as we go within development partners and within businesses, there are some key transitions in personnel. So we shall see whether the changes that we've instituted really do stick and help Somalia into the future. Thanks, Mike.
Well, thank you, Aysha. It's really fascinating to hear about the complexity of doing that kind of work in a very fragile setting like Somalia. And in a way, I mean, again, I don't want to simplify what you're saying, but it sounds like your story really chimes with one of the messages in the policy note, which is around the importance of kind of pooling knowledge between donors and practitioners and the private sector, and how that in itself is crucial to enabling the kind of flexibility that we know is, and the adaptability of programming, which you just talked about, which is the key to success. So yeah, would you say that was kind of one way of summing it up?
Totally. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Finally, Corrie, sorry, finally, we're going to have Karri talking about the policy notes in a second, but just before we do that, Corrie Sissons is going to talk a little bit from the perspective of Catholic Relief Services.
Thanks, Mike. So to bring us into land, I wanted to share with you a story about a tailor called Mohammed. And he lives in a town called Teknaf, which is in Cox's Bazar in southern Bangladesh. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the context, Cox's Bazar is one of the poorest regions of an already fragile country. And this region saw what was at the time the biggest influx of refugees since the Rwandan genocide, when in 2017, about 500,000 Rohingya Muslims fled conflict in Myanmar and arrived in Bangladesh. And this was a situation where the original population at the time, I think, was about 1.3 million. So the Rohingya at this time started to constitute about 1/3 of the total population in the greater Cox's Bazar area. And a huge humanitarian response was mounted that I think many of us are aware of, on top of existing development programming. And as this humanitarian response was mounted, many agencies started looking at market-based responses really early on. So agencies like CRS did a shelter market, Emma, but also other agencies, when they were doing their rapid assessments like Oxfam and World Vision, they included market information. And what we saw was a rise of market support activities, innovative voucher programming, things like vendor networking and support to vendors. And this is where Mohammed comes in. So I remember meeting him back in 2017 as part of a needs assessment. And one of the first things he asked me is, where do your clothes come from? And Bangladesh is really proud of its clothing markets. You know, anyone that's worked there will know this. And he wanted to know from me, why are we distributing clothes when we could be using his services? So what we did with the NGO I was with at the time is we set up just that. We did vouchers for tailoring services, and we supported the local market whilst allowing the Rohingya, who were unable to receive cash at the time due to government policy, to choose their own clothing. And we also simplified the process to take part, so small vendors like Mohammed could participate. And as a result, Mohammed was able to increase his business, take on more staff, and the evaluation showed that he'd also increased his client base and started to train up and employ women. And the increasing number of contacts and transactions between refugees and host communities through market-based programs in this area, like the one that Mohammed took part in, have continued to this day, which is fantastic. And they're shaping the local economy and reducing tensions between these two communities. And what I think is fantastic is that this hasn't just taken part in protection and NFI, but we've also seen this across the entire response. So food security, WASH, and actually the 2020 humanitarian response plan has now had a strategic shift where it's 100% through vouchers and fund sectors, which is great. So I'm just sharing this with you as my sort of story, because I think this is a really great example of a response that was market aware from the beginning. So when needs assessments included markets early on, and where development actors were brought in, and we had a better, more market-based result in a fragile conflict as a result. So yeah, that's my story.
Yeah, what a great story. Thank you very much. And thank you for summing it up so succinctly as well. It means I don't need to, but that's great. Okay, I think on that basis, we can move straight over to you, Karri, because you're going to tell us about these policy notes that you wrote.
Absolutely. If I can get the computer to move me forward. There we go. Yeah, no, I think these stories are really important. We wanted to tell these stories to you, the audience, today, because we recognize them as things that we all can relate And I think that they are the core of why these policy notes are so needed. So I'm going to give you just a teaser of the document. I'm going to ask Isabel to put the link, there it is, into the chat. It is really, really worthwhile to look through the document, because I would never try in this, I've only got 6 slides. I'm not going to go into the depth of the case studies and the resources that are connected there. But we do want to kind of point you to a couple of things, help you understand how we came about to writing this set of documents. As the first starting point, though, I think it's important to say that we get it that fragility is very complex. The policy note does not go into the rich, multifaceted thing that we know to be fragility, but we wanted to acknowledge that it is built on the understanding that is the case. If you're not familiar with it, this States of Fragility tool does a great job of really looking at that complexity that we see in fragile contexts, why different countries are fragile in different ways. And I think that gives us a great jumping off point for how we work with markets in different kinds of fragility. So anyway, to let you know that resource is maybe our jumping off point for this policy note. There also was a clear message that came out through the process that the language around market programming and MSD is confusing to a lot of people. So we included definitions that would help kind of get everyone on the same page. And articulated some of those specific differences when humanitarian teams talk about their market work versus when more development teams talk about their market work. And there was a wonderful conversation that came out of the implementers note, because you will see that there are 2 notes. The implementer group really found it valuable to dig into the perspective that humanitarians come to markets from versus the perspective that, market systems or development folks come from. And so that question that you see there, how does market-based programming differ from MSD programming? And the implementer note goes into that question a bit more for you. So that provides a valuable insight, I think, to help us understand how each side is looking at things. Apologies. So let me talk about the process just for a second. The process of developing these notes, really, it started with a literature review that was initiated and driven by DCED and the forming of 2 groups, 2 working groups, a donor group and an implementer group. And we worked quite a bit to make sure that those groups would be diverse, different types of donors. We had foundations, we had European and American donors, we had emergency and development donors, and we tried to get some breadth and depth in both groups. So the implementer group also had a range of different types of implementer, emergency and development, more focused on markets, broad. And so then the literature review was done, and the 2 groups reflected on what kind of came out of the literature review around MSD in fragile and conflict-affected situations. And the 5 points that you see here on the screen were the challenges that came up most clearly and most often. So they provided the foundation then of the recommendations that you see in the policy notes. And it was a really great process. While the 2 groups worked separately, they really did cross-fertilize the idea of each of the others. And you'll find in the notes that the recommendations are the same in both notes, so coming from both groups, but what that means, how that is interpreted, that comes out much differently in each of the notes. So we also, the note also includes a number of frameworks, but I wanted to highlight this one in particular. I think it's really helpful for folks who've been working on MSD for a while to know that there is a version of the M4P Donut that we use and love so much that's been put into humanitarian language by the Markets in Crisis community of practice. And I think it's a really useful tool for helping kind of translate what are core concepts in MSD into the humanitarian language and perspective, way of approaching the challenges that you see in fragile contexts. And you can see as you look at this graphic that you have what we're familiar with. The policies, norms, and rules are there at the top, and the services and infrastructure is at the bottom. And then through the middle, right at the center, you see market-aware programming. So using markets, that might be the way you choose to procure a humanitarian program or doing cash programming. And then as you move out to the edges, it's much more what MSD practitioners would recognize as core MSD programming. And I think that understanding of each fragile context will be at a different place when you approach it, and will be moving in along, hopefully improving the market systems and the way they work over time. And so this kind of framework helps us, fragile contexts are the place that it's most likely to find both humanitarian and development actors. So a framework like this is really where we're going to gather a common understanding around the approach that a humanitarian takes to markets, the approach that development actors take, and how do we work together and coordinate and overlap appropriately. So to me, that's why this is a really important resource, is so that we have a common reference point, regardless of the approach that you're coming from, where, what your own perspective is. And I guess just to bring COVID in one more time, I actually think that the COVID experience that we've just all gone through, whether you're talking about the health response or the economic implications of the pandemic, is an excellent example of how we need to recognize that there's going to be an immediate crisis response that is absolutely the right thing to do in that moment and will have economic implications. But as things settle down a little bit, we've had it be 18 months, 2 years kind of, we have a better ability to project what's going to happen next, and we have a better handle on the economic elements of what the pandemic has meant. And so we can have more systematic approaches. And so really it's a good recognition that we need both. How we have them work together and weave together is really the most important part of the conversation. And I would say that's where these notes really sit, is in how do we have this conversation together? How do we work towards the same kind of set of recommendations? So you've probably clicked on the link that Isabel put in there. There are 10 recommendations for MSD programming in fragile and conflict affected settings, FICUS. As I said before, the recommendations are the same in each paper policy note, but how they are to be implemented, the suggestions are different. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples here. So for example, encouraging collaboration. That's going to look very different for an implementer that has in it, well, like CRS, with both a humanitarian and a development team. There's a different kind of internal collaboration than perhaps for a donor like ECHO that largely focuses only on emergency programming. So the way you look at collaboration is going to be designed differently. Or you can see the fourth one over talks about supporting critical market systems. Well, that's going to be different for a humanitarian agency. It might be done through the way the procurement is done, like the example that Corrie provided, or the ones that Sasha was alluding to, than it would be if you were doing kind of pure MSD. And how do you look for opportunities to bring those two approaches together to complement each other and not overlap? So I'm not going to read, I'm assuming everyone on the webinar is able to see and read the slides. So I'm not going to read out each of these recommendations. There's a lot more in the paper. It's also, this is now a good time for us to really pivot back to the panel and to you guys. I am sure that everybody on this call has lots of stories of their own, like our panelists started out with, and also examples. And we would love to hear your questions and your examples of how these recommendations have been implemented or could be implemented better. So I'll leave it there, Mike.
Thank you very much, Karri. Thank you for sticking so tightly to the time that we allocated. So yeah, just to remind you, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and if you click on there, you can submit a question. We've had one question already, but actually only one. So I'm really hoping that there are some more coming along. But while you think about that, we also had some questions in advance from people through the registration process for the webinar. So I'm going to pick a few of those at random to share. And I think, Karri, we should probably invite all of the panelists back on board, as it were, to potentially chip in and give their thoughts on this. So why don't we dive straight in at probably the most interesting question that was thrown up, and this came from Muench from Opportunities Unlimited, and the question is, how can donor systems, in other words, donors' funding approaches and their strategies, help programs come up with a more coherent response that helps communities navigate all of these complexities? So I don't know, that's how can donor systems, their funding systems and their strategies help in this situation with these kind of issues? So I don't know whether Aysha or Laura, you would like to chip in.
I can try. Aysha, I'm hoping you're available too. I don't have the excuse of poor connectivity. I think that's a really good question and something that we try to do. USAID BHA's guidelines that came out, goodness, almost a year ago now, in October of 2020. We do try to encourage better planning, what's the overall context, what's the handoff. We've been trying to do more, not long-term programming exactly, but have a little bit more flexibility so that we're not stuck to only 12 months or less. And, I should also say we've been learning too, right? With COVID, we did a lot of response over the last year in places where we don't typically have much of a response. We stand up fairly significant humanitarian responses in places that are mostly populated by development actors, where we don't have a long-standing thing. So instead of Sasha's monster that we created, it's more of, okay, how are we slotting ourselves in here? How do we want to identify sort of what's our, and when I say our, I mean on the humanitarian side, like what's our appropriate role so that we're not undermining the development work that's going on or partnering with it where we can. I am certainly not going to claim that we have figured this out yet, or the answers. And I would definitely welcome, I think advice from our implementing partners on what sorts of things work, what sorts of things sound good on paper, but in reality don't really make any sense. or I see Sasha laughing, or what sorts of things are downright useless. Okay.
Maybe Aysha wants to add to that, but I've got something I can say as well, which is free, everyone. I've got a free suggestion. One of the things that has come out of not only the literature review, but also just experience in the field for 20 years is that donors can signal to implementers that this kind of creative thinking is allowed. And what I mean is I've seen a lot of people say something is not possible because it's not in the, it's not allowed by the structure of our programming, when actually if you go through and read the agreement, it's not forbidden. So you probably should ask if it's allowed or not. So on the donor side, signal to your implementers that these kinds of, that this is what we want for them. We want this kind of collaboration. We want coordination and sequencing across partners. On the implementer side, ask your donor, we want to do this thing. This is why we think it's justified. We think it's allowed by our agreement. Do you think that too? It's absolutely free to ask and to signal. So that would be one of my big recommendations.
Karri, I totally agree with those, and a couple more from the implementer side. I think it would be great if donors more proactively, as you said, because we should ask more, but provide the funding and the space for that market analysis. And it's allowing it to be done, both it's the money, but it's also giving the time. So not rushing for a response so fast that you go for the first thing you've thought of, that you actually do the market analysis that Corrie was alluding to in the Bangladesh example. And then having that, allowing the space for transition. So you have the immediate humanitarian response, but keeping the program timelines long enough that you can evolve as the situation changes. But I don't know, maybe Aysha has a different perspective from the other side.
I don't know if it's different. I think it's complementary. So from our side, I think we're just trying to be a bit more systematic in bringing together the humanitarian and the development sides of the houses in various kind of key junctures of our programming. I mean, the design is a bit of a no-brainer, and essentially it kind of has to go through, where there are livelihoods kind of elements, it has to go through both sides of the house in order to move forward. And I think we're seeing that much more kind of joint programming approach, whether just by kind of individual development agencies or broader, just in with the aim of kind of really responding to government's agendas around collaboration, coordination, etc. I think, tangibly in terms of how we flex and respond, yeah, I've mentioned at the design stage of programs that we kind of essentially design flexible and adaptive programs. And I think, even on the humanitarian side, that's starting to filter into the way that they think, whether it's by having an element that is dedicated to contingency, because we know that there will be a contingency in contexts like Somalia, or it's, having a stronger link from the get-go with the ECDev side by, my example, I mentioned agricultural inputs, but you're always kind of keeping a view to the markets in which you're kind of working and doing that underlying analysis, as you were saying, Sasha, not just on the markets, but also on the needs. So it isn't just sometimes around kind of availability, it's around purchasing power, it's around a whole number of factors that the market can speak to if you speak to the market. So yeah, I think I agree with what everybody has said, and I think efforts to become more systematic are really kind of starting to pay off in some of these contexts.
And if I could just add really quickly, because I know we want to get through the questions, just to say something which no one has said, which is please collect market monitoring data. not just market analysis. And I think one thing that donors can do is actually ask implementers to provide it. We've just done an internal kind of look within CRS at some of our market monitoring. And one of the things that many of our implementing country programs have said is donors don't ask for market monitoring data, so we don't have an incentive to collect it. So I think it's good to kind of, from both sides, be collecting, but also asking for data throughout the program cycle, especially in some of these contexts, and using things like the market tool that we have in CRS, but other things that are out there, to not just collect market information at the beginning of the program, but throughout. Sorry, over.
Mike will get angry, but yeah, I think that's an excellent one. And just from a donor perspective, in terms of being cost efficient, one of the things that we have really found pays dividends is the collaborative, where multiple agencies are feeding in for market monitoring, especially in places like Syria, like Yemen, really anywhere that there's the joint market monitoring going on, that seems to really benefit the entire humanitarian community, and is invaluable for us as well.
Great. Okay, I'm going to interrupt now. I mean, I don't want to stop this rich conversation, but there are some questions. Here's a really quick one, which I think in a way we might have covered with Corrie's story, but can you cite examples of procurement that minimizes market disruption?
Oh, I mean, definitely. I mean, I can leave others to contribute, but I think this is a recommendation from the policy paper, but often standard tender processes that you might launch may not advantage or include some market actors that we might want to work with as part of a market-based program. So thinking again, to the Bangladesh example I gave, I think lots of agencies launched tender processes which initially worked with very large vendors because you needed lots of criteria, and there were people coming from Dhaka and Chittagong, whereas there was this kind of shift towards, actually, if we just give a bit of information to small vendors of kind of, vegetables, say locally, they can get a trade license quite easily, and then they have the minimum criteria to meet our internal policies. I know lots of agencies have kind of SOPs that have kind of, that sort of derogation possibility. I know we do at CRS, I know Oxfam does, lots of other agencies do, and I think it's quite a simple thing to make a change for, but then you're not bringing in additional actors and sort of changing purchasing patterns of communities. So yeah, that's just a very quick example. I don't know, Sasha or anyone else, if you've got other ones.
I'll jump in. I think it's Simon Levine wrote a really interesting paper on this, and I believe it's one of the sources that's linked in the document. It might be in the donor document, but not in the implementer ones, because different stuff came up. Mike, doesn't BEAM also have a good set of procurement tools that a little bit speak to this point? I feel like I remember from the adaptive management space some interesting procurement tools that are really useful, helpful.
Yes, absolutely. We have a series of papers all about procurement issues in market systems development programming. They're not specific to humanitarian settings though, but they certainly have lots of sort of tips around what donors and implementers can do to make the whole procurement process more kind of market system friendly. Isabel, maybe you can stick a link to those papers in the chat box, but if you go to the Beam Exchange website, you can search for procurement and you'll find it really quickly.
Yeah, and then that's where that one framework that I did put up reminds us that even if they are MSD tools, you can look at them with that framework in mind and move in your own head and own experience, that move them towards the humanitarian if that's the need or the context.
Okay, can I move on to the next question? So Nawaz asked, from your experience, do you think that this approach, using a market systems kind of framework or a market-based program, can be applied in all of the sort of sectors, humanitarian sectors, or are there particular ones where it's stronger or a better fit?
And I can just jump in from experience. One of the most obvious ones is water. right? And often water, clean water is a huge issue in a humanitarian setting. And our traditional response has been to truck out water. But in most of the contexts where we work, people already purchase clean water. And so we can work with those private sector actors to make clean water available and support the private sector. So that's a very simple example to say, yes, I personally believe it applies in any sector. I have yet to see a sector where it doesn't, but I don't know, maybe somebody else has found one.
I mean, I'll say, to me, it really depends so much on your context, right? For all of these things, there's some kind of a system or market that's trying to address those needs, right? There's somebody trying to do education, there's somebody trying to provide health, there's somebody providing water and soap and things like that. Depending, again, just in my experience, on the urgency of the needs that you're trying to meet and kind of what the capacity and status of that system is, and whether there are any barriers to you working with that system, right? There are some fragile contexts where we can't engage with the actors providing it for one reason or another. But if those actors are able to be supported and strengthened either alongside more direct provision of services and goods, or instead of, again, depending on what you're trying to do and how long you have to do it, then yes, I do think market systems development type principles can often be appropriate.
Right, and this is part of that recommendation, I think, around supporting critical market systems. As you said, Laura, there's always some kind of system in place. So does that make it a critical market system that needs to be looked at? Is that what is happening?
Yeah, I mean, if I could come in just to say, you know, I'm a private sector development advisor, so I think that most systems and most sectors can be supported. But I guess, I mean, there are using market system development principles. I guess it does depend upon the kind of market dynamic, and it also depends upon the constraints within the specific ecosystem. Laura alluded to some of the kind of political economy challenges around using particular providers, and that can kind of be, you can be broader in terms of various kind of market actors and the size of the market they control and how they do so. So, you know, within Somalia, I mentioned a very kind of dynamic context with a very strong private sector, but there are some geographic constraints to the areas in which we can develop this kind of approach, just as much because we can't get physical access to them because they're so massively insecure. So within limits, yes, I entirely agree that there aren't very many systems, whether they're service or product related, that can't be subject to these principles.
Thank you very much, Aysha. Okay, I've got a really juicy question here from Perrine, which I think could open up probably another hour of debate. But anyway, I'll see what you think. It says, Perrine says that they sometimes see a tension between localization processes involving local actors more in response, and the pivoting towards more market-based approaches. And they're speaking from the context, from the experience in Somalia. Any tips to manage the risks or strengthen the systems? What resources do we have that can contribute to setting local agencies on the right path so that they feel confident that they can manage this shift?
I'm going to beg Sasha. I'm just thinking of the piece that your colleague Grace Becton wrote about her work in Uganda.
That's me. Now I'm desperately going to have to remember Grace's fabulous paper, or hope I get a sneaky Skype from one of my Mercy Corps colleagues. But it did remind me of the early days of market system development, when we were having the same question with, can our field teams do market system development? And the short answer is, it's all about training. And what we need to do as we're working on localization, we need to train people up to do that analysis, to think that way. Then the matter is, who are the facilitators? We don't have to be the facilitators. We can pass that on to others as we localize, and they can become the facilitators. And as I'm being rapidly reminded, though when MSD is in principle localization, right? That's what it is doing, is passing all of the activities and functions down to the local level. And I will post a link to that document to the chat box now. But Laura, feel free to add.
I just did to save you since you were talking. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that oh, perfect. Okay, great. Go everybody. One of the things that really jumped out at me from her work was talking about how when you are recruiting staff for skills or picking your local organization, that it isn't necessarily so much having particular experience in doing, say, humanitarian work, as it is picking people with kind of the right mindset about how to work through markets and how to do less. And that can be challenging, right? For a variety of reasons. I think most local organizations who have been sub-awardees are often limited in their past experience to doing direct provision of goods or services. And that's been a disservice, frankly, right, to everybody. Mm-hmm. And so kind of flipping that around and thinking not, we need people who know how to do a distribution, and more, we need people who are, able to think about things in a new way, whether they have a totally different kind of professional background or what have you, that might be something that you're looking for now. So maybe you're looking for different types of partners or different types of skills.
And I think one of the tactics you can use, because so often we say, oh, but they don't have any experience. We want to work with a local organization, but they don't have the experience. And one of the tactics that I've seen successfully used is having almost a mentor. We called it a critical friend. So in this particular case, it was about USAID acceptable financial reports, right? So a certain standard is expected of a local organization if they're going to have a certain level of participation in the project. And they didn't have that capacity, because why would they ever have learned how to write USAID appropriate financial reports? And don't get caught up on the specific skill. But what we did was assigned one of our good local staff members in our organization to be their mentor, to literally sit with their staff in their office at least half the time, just kind of doing it with them. And that was somebody who did work for the international organization, but their main job was building the capacity to make it so that the local organization could do the thing instead of the international organization doing the thing. And I think the point here is build in those people in your program design, budget for them so that you can localize much quicker, because you've just flipped what you flipped it. So they're doing and you're mentoring, as opposed to you doing, sort of with them on the side.
Yeah, maybe just to add really quickly, two things that I'm kind of reflecting on with kind of the whole localization of markets. Number one, cash as kind of an entry point. I feel like lots of local partners are kind of excited about cash. And even though we in the market sphere say, cash is one type of market-based programming, it's much kind of bigger. Karri showed the framework, it's a much kind of bigger world of options. That's quite a good entry point, because you have local partners that are excited about or have done some cash programming and might have some skills there, at least around cash feasibility, which is not unlinked to market assessments. And secondly, languages. We are trying to do a lot with Indonesia, for example, at the moment, and they've got a lot written about cash for shelter, and we're trying to do market-based shelter programming, but all of the documents are being produced in English. And in a country like Indonesia, where there's a heavy focus on, nationalizing the response, that's not very useful. So I think, we do need to start, and I know this guidance note is going to be available in other languages, I think, but we do need to start kind of making sure that we have things that are not just in English as well.
Okay, so look, I'm going to jump in and I'm going to merge two questions together since we're running out of time. So there's a question in the chat box by an anonymous attendee, which really is asking about, if you like, the tension between the different drivers that are coming from the two sides. So sustainability, you know, the markets people are really thinking about long-term sustainability, whereas maybe the humanitarians are thinking more about priorities around doing no harm, and I mean around good targeting and getting support quickly to people. So I guess where do those tensions manifest themselves? Well, they probably manifest themselves around how you evaluate the impact or the results of interventions. So there was another question from Gordon Freer earlier in the registration saying, you know, how do you evaluate programs in fragile, how do you evaluate MSD projects in fragile settings, where essentially you've got this tension between quick and well-targeted responses and sustainability and long-term recovery?
I had this big sighing moment on that one, and I would encourage anyone who's not a member of the MIC community practice to join that, because I feel like this is one of the eternal debates we have over and over on that. But I think getting at the initial part of that question, you know, one of the things we talk about is timeframes. And there's immediate impact and then the longer term impact of that. And you can help somebody in the moment, but actually, as in the Palestine case and many other cases, just create dependency in the long term. Mm-hmm. And so we have to think about, how do we save lives? How do we meet immediate needs, but not do it in a way that undermines all the work we're going to want to do in the next 5 years, which sounds nice and simple. And we all spend a lot of time debating deeply how we do that, which Corrie, I know, has lots of ideas on how.
Yeah, I think in our experience, again, it's, I mean, I hate to just keep saying it's so context dependent, but it is so context dependent. I was working a lot on our Northern Triangle response earlier this year in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and you know, the kinds of things that we can do in contexts like that to meet humanitarian needs while not getting in the way of or undermining the significant existing and new development investments that are going on is much simpler, right? You know, we can do a lot of cash assistance to meet basic needs, which we do. We can take advantage of the many financial service providers that already exist there, which we do. We can, you know, provide on the smaller side livelihood assistance so that farmers and tiny micro enterprises can get back on their feet while the development work kind of reaches for the next tier, which is all, again, things that we can do, right? You know, we can meet wash needs, we can meet shelter needs through local markets. I mean, I don't want to say it's easy, it has plenty of its own challenges, but, you know, again, where there are more functional markets, I think it's a lot simpler. It's really tough where there's thin markets.
But I think even when you have thin markets, you know, there's always something there. It's very rare that we are trying to create an entirely new, doesn't exist in any way kind of market. So there's always something there. And that just takes me back to, if you're really looking at which markets are critical and why does my organization say that this is the critical market? That's your starting point. So even when markets are thin, you have something to build on, either in that country or in countries nearby. I often find, because I work in East Africa a lot, you know, Kenya or Uganda may have something that if I tried to say, oh, you know, Mongolia has this great example for you, people go, who cares? But if I say, hey, Uganda has this great example for you, they're willing to look at it. So even when we're talking about thin markets, I think you've got to start where you are, and it's about, you know, how do you measure it was part of the question that Mike had heard. And I think you sit down, implementers and donors sit down and have a really good hard think in this case, knowing what we would like to have in terms of MSD indicators and where we actually are, basically that last, be realistic when working in fragile contexts. what would success look like in the time we have with the budget we have? And it's a conversation. You sit down and you use the resources you have to figure out where you want to be. Because if you don't do that, you can't really, you either automatically fail because you just don't know if you succeeded, or you leave it really open to a set of unrealistic expectations. So that would be my answer on the measurement side.
From my side.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Aysha.
Thanks. Yes. So go on.
Oh,
go on,
sorry,
Mike.
Aysha. I'm just going to quickly interrupt you. I mean, I'm not stopping you, but I'm just going to say I'm going to apply a little bit of latitude here because technically we've kind of reached the end of our hour. But this is such an interesting conversation. I do want it to continue. But if people obviously attending wish to leave, or there will be a recording available, and we'll share it with you so you can catch up later. But let's just carry on for a few short minutes more, just to make sure we can. I think this is a really nice topic to end on, actually, because it kind of sums things up. But yeah, let's just add 5 more minutes to the webinar and see how far we go. Aysha.
Super, thanks. So I'm kind of looking at it from the other perspective. So we're all about kind of sustainability, and then how do we react to crises as they emerge. And as I say, you know, for us, it's really key to have a really strong kind of theory of change. Yes, that has kind of immediate, quick wins and gains, and then the longer term gains. But also to have lots of flexibility built into the program so that it can flex. So, you know, in response to a crisis a few years back, we had a contingency fund which allowed us to do things like public works and things in order to maintain certain levels of economic activity and infrastructure, as well as kind of market functioning, and to allow people to kind of survive any kind of crisis. So I think, you know, it comes back to these fundamentals which are in the guide around having these conversations, having strong between partners, having strong theories of change, trusting that your implementing partners know the contexts well. Have done, you know, the underpinning analysis, and then can flex in response, in coordination with some of the other kind of fora that exist, whether it's on resilience or on humanitarian assistance. So, you know, as I mentioned, food pricing is an issue. Okay, so we're talking to the humanitarians to kind of coordinate on cash transfers in this area. Inputs are going to be a problem for this next season. We're working with this input supplier to enable kind of improved seeds to be available at a price that is, you know, is accessible by people with reduced kind of purchasing power. So I think, you know, yeah, being very clear on your outcomes and impacts at the end, but then, you know, being pragmatic to say, so it's not just all about growth now, it's about survival and it's income generating activity. So perhaps we, within the space of the next year, kind of reduce targets on growth and adjust them, instead of to take into account new jobs created, actually jobs that were at risk that have been protected, or incomes that were at risk that have been protected, you know, those kind of elements.
I think those are really excellent points. I mean, the other thing that occurred to me, you know, especially Karri, I mean, it's completely right? There's always something there. But looking at the last question posed in here from Namris about the imperfections of the private sector, you know, I mean, every single market is a power space, right? There are people who are not in power. There are people who are not properly treated, people who don't have the ability to advocate for safe working conditions, who don't get paid the same amount, who get left out of opportunities, right? And I think that, at least for me, what I struggle with as an economic recovery advisor in short-term programming is, right, again, that being realistic, right? And what can we, you know, how do we make that decision between, okay, we're going to work with these actors knowing that they come with these unfair power dynamics, having that humanitarian mandate to do no harm and to, you know, promote equity. Do we engage because those are the folks who were there, and those are the folks who are going to be there after we're done? How do we engage with them, and what kind of progress is realistic to think about in a year, in 18 months, right? You know, I think we've all ourselves experienced various versions of what it's like to not be an equal player in a given space. And yeah, that's just something that I'm always trying to grapple with.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, it's why I'm really pleased. Just one final thing, that one of the 10 recommendations is around investing in women, because I often think that's a really kind of obvious thing to kind of do if you've got unequal markets, especially where women don't take part. So I'm particularly keen that that's kind of one of the recommendations from the guidance note as well.
Thank you, Laura and Corrie. Yeah, I mean, by the way, so you were sort of addressing a question which people haven't necessarily seen, which was right at the end of the list around how to avoid the how to sort of deal with the limitations and imperfections of the private sector as partners in humanitarian settings. Okay, I'm really sorry to be the one who has to sort of draw the line under this conversation, because we are well over time, but it's been really fascinating. I hope people will take the opportunity to read Karri's papers, these two versions of the policy note, and that the conversations will continue in the markets and crisis space, and also in the Beam Exchange space. We have our LinkedIn forum, for example, and I'm sure that the people here would be interested to get further comments. We would be very interested to get further comments on these papers. So if you upload them from the Beam Exchange, you can also put in comments or send me comments on the policy notes that you think would add value to them. We really want them to get out there and be used. Before you go, please do give us some feedback on this webinar. There's a little link in the chat box which you can see. It's a little quick form, take you 30 seconds, a minute to just give us a quick bit of feedback. Otherwise, while you're doing that, I'll just have to say massive thanks to Karri Byrne, to Corrie, to Sasha, to Laura Meissner, and to Aysha Johnson for joining us today and for creating a really interesting space, I think. Any final words from you all?
Thanks a lot. It was great.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.